History remembers Constantine the Great as the emperor who changed the Roman world forever. He marched under the banner of the cross, legalized Christianity, and built a new capital at Constantinople. His reign marked a turning point in European history, the moment when a persecuted religion became entangled with imperial power. But centuries after his death, Constantine's name became linked to something very different. Not a battle or a council, but a document, a piece of parchment that claimed to reshape the empire itself. On the surface, it seemed unremarkable, just another imperial decree written on vellum and fastened with a wax seal. But what it claimed was extraordinary. It declared that Constantine had given away Rome itself, and with it, authority over Rome, Italy, and the provinces of the Western Roman Empire, and not to another emperor, but to the Pope. For nearly 1,000 years, this donation of Constantine was treated as fact. It was cited in legal codes, invoked to challenge kings, and used to justify the papacy's rule over central Italy. According to this document, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual shepherd. He was the landlord of Europe. There was only one problem. Constantine never wrote it. To understand why this forgery worked, you need to understand Constantine's place in Roman memory. In the early 4th century, Christianity was still fragile. Roman authorities had persecuted believers under emperors like Decius and Diocletian. Christians were scattered, sometimes tolerated, often hunted. Most of the empire still honored Jupiter, Mars, and the traditional gods. That changed when Constantine rose to power. According to Eusebius, who says Constantine himself recounted the story to him, in 312, as he marched to face his rival Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine saw a cross of light in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." That night, he dreamed of Christ, who told him to use the chairo, the monogram of his name, as a safeguard in battle. Constantine obeyed, ordered the symbol placed on his soldiers' shields, and the next day, he triumphed. He entered Rome in victory and credited the Christian God for his success. A year later, he issued the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity across the empire. With imperial backing, the faith exploded into public life. Constantine funded the construction of churches, gave bishops new privileges, and in 325 he summoned the Council of Nicaea, the first major attempt to unify Christian doctrine. By the time Constantine died in 337, Christianity was no longer a fringe sect. It was on its way to becoming the empire's defining religion. Later generations remembered him as the emperor who gave the church legitimacy, wealth, and status, which made him the perfect figure for a medieval forgery. If Constantine had granted the Pope authority, who could question it? According to the donation, Constantine had been struck with leprosy. His doctors could do nothing, and the emperor was desperate. Then came Pope Sylvester I, who baptized him. The baptism, the text says, miraculously cured Constantine. Grateful beyond measure, Constantine rewarded Sylvester in the grandest way possible. He declared that the Pope was now the spiritual leader of all Christianity, and more importantly, the ruler of Rome, Italy, and the provinces in the West. The text went further. It explained why Constantine left Rome and founded Constantinople. He couldn't remain in the city, the document claimed, because Rome was no longer his. It belonged to the Pope. For medieval readers, this wasn't just a story about a miracle. It read like a legal charter, a binding contract that made the papacy supreme over the West, with the Pope not simply as the head of the church, but as the emperor's heir. In reality, Constantine never had leprosy. He was never cured by Sylvester, never gifted Rome to the Pope, and never signed such a document. The donation of Constantine was a product of the 8th century, nearly 400 years after Constantine's death. The timing was no coincidence. In the mid-700s, the papacy was under pressure. The Lombards, a Germanic people, threatened Rome and its surroundings. The Byzantine emperors in Constantinople were too distant and too weak to help. At the same time, a new power was rising in the West, the Franks. Pope Stephen II turned to Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, for protection. Pepin defeated the Lombards and granted the Pope control over territories in central Italy. This became the foundation of the Papal States. But land given by a Frankish king was one thing. A legal charter from Constantine the Great was something else entirely. That's where the donation came in. It gave divine and imperial legitimacy to papal rule. It wasn't just a pragmatic deal with the Franks, it was the continuation of Constantine's will. The donation spelled out Constantine's gift in detail. It said the Pope was granted authority over the Lateran Palace in Rome, the city of Rome itself. all of Italy, and the provinces of the West. It described the Pope's spiritual supremacy over all bishops and his temporal rule over lands. The language was sweeping. The Pope, according to the document, was more than the head of the Church. He was a ruler above rulers. For medieval clerics and jurists, this was dynamite. It provided a foundation to argue that the Pope was not subordinate to kings or emperors. On the contrary, they owed their authority to him. Once it entered circulation, the donation became part of canon law. It was cited in collections like the Decretum Gratiani in the 12th century. When popes faced off against emperors or kings, the document was ready to be pulled out as Exhibit A. It gave legal and historical cover to the Papal States, the stretch of territory across central Italy that popes claimed as their own. It justified papal involvement in imperial coronations, reminding rulers that their crowns were worn by Constantine's gift. Even when popes weren't waving it in front of kings, the donation sat in the background like a loaded weapon. It was the anchor of papal supremacy. Looking back, it seems incredible that such a forgery lasted so long, but in the medieval world, it fit perfectly. Few people had the education to analyze Latin critically, and even fewer would dare to accuse the papacy of fraud. The story itself, Constantine falling ill, being cured through baptism, and then rewarding the Pope, sounded plausible in a world steeped in miracle stories and saintly legends. It was too convenient, too useful, and too authoritative to question, and so, for centuries, the donation of Constantine stood unchallenged. But eventually, the Renaissance brought new tools: sharper scholarship, critical reading, and humanist skepticism. And when one man finally examined the donation closely, the illusion unraveled. With the donation in their pocket, popes of the Middle Ages wielded an authority few religious leaders in history have ever matched. It wasn't just that they were shepherds of Christendom. Thanks to Constantine, or so the document claimed, they were also heirs to the Roman West. Pepin the Short's real donation of land in the 750s had given the papacy its first foothold as a territorial power, but the forged donation of Constantine gave that foothold a story, a precedent stretching back to antiquity. The donation was rarely the sole weapon in papal disputes, but it added legitimacy to sweeping claims. During the investiture controversy of the 11th century, when Pope Gregory VII insisted that only the papacy could appoint bishops, the conflict with Emperor Henry IV hinged on who held ultimate authority in Christendom. Gregory's arguments leaned mostly on reform decrees and theology, but the donation had long been part of the background. It was one of the texts that supported the larger idea that emperors themselves ruled only with papal approval. Later, in the 13th century, Pope Innocent III presided like a monarch over Europe's kings. He excommunicated rulers, intervened in dynastic disputes, and asserted a right to judge secular as well as spiritual matters. The donation wasn't his central argument, but it gave weight to the wider tradition of papal supremacy. The irony, of course, is that all this authority was being justified in part by a document that never came from Constantine at all. By the late Middle Ages, the intellectual climate of Europe was shifting. The scholastic tradition of the universities encouraged closer reading of texts. The revival of classical studies brought a new respect for precise Latin. And into this world stepped Lorenzo Valla. Valla was a humanist scholar working in the 15th century. Around 1440, he took a hard look at the donation of Constantine. His expertise wasn't in theology, but in language. He knew his Latin, and as he read the document line by line, problems leapt out at him. The Latin of the donation wasn't the Latin of Constantine's time. It used vocabulary and phrasing that belonged to the Middle Ages, not the 4th century. It mentioned things Constantine could not have known. It described structures and offices that did not exist until centuries after his death. For Valla, the verdict was obvious. This was not a Roman imperial decree. It was a medieval forgery. He wrote a treatise laying out his findings on the donation of Constantine. In it, he systematically dismantled the document's authenticity. His work was not fiery rhetoric, but methodical philology, an analysis of words, grammar, and context that revealed the donation for what it was. Exposing the donation was risky. The document had been a cornerstone of papal authority for centuries. To call it a fake was to accuse the church of building its power on fraud. Yet Valla was not executed or silenced. He eventually found employment in the papal curia itself, under Pope Nicholas V. His analysis circulated in manuscript, and while not immediately printed, it was known among scholars. When printing spread in the 16th century, Valla's treatise reached a wider audience. By then, the world had changed. Reformers like Martin Luther seized on it as proof of papal corruption. If the donation of Constantine was a forgery, they argued, what else in Rome's authority rested on deception? By the time Valla's work exploded into wider circulation, the donation's direct political role had faded. The papacy no longer leaned on it as heavily as in earlier centuries. Its practical authority came from armies, taxes, alliances, and the weight of tradition. But the exposure of the forgery struck at the Church's credibility. Protestants used it as a weapon, pointing to the donation as evidence that the papacy was less a divine institution than a worldly empire built on lies. It became part of the arsenal of critiques that fueled the Reformation. For Luther, Calvin, and others, the donation was a perfect symbol, a forgery that had shaped real politics, proof that the papacy's authority was human invention rather than divine will. The story of the donation of Constantine reminds us of how powerful documents could be in the medieval world. Most people never saw them, most never read them. But when priests, bishops, and rulers invoked them, they carried an aura of authority. Words written in ink could bind kings, redraw maps, and justify wars. A parchment, properly framed, could be as mighty as a sword. That was the strength of the donation. It looked like law, it looked like history, and for centuries, that was enough. In the end, the donation of Constantine tells two stories. One is about the Middle Ages, when the papacy rose to temporal power and a single document could legitimize an empire. The other is about the Renaissance, when scholars like Lorenzo Valla proved that even centuries of authority could be questioned with careful reading. The papacy survived, but its image was changed. What had once crowned popes as emperors became a symbol of how fragile power can be when it rests on false foundations. Constantine never wrote it, but for nearly a millennium, Europe lived as if he had.